Eastern Europe, January through June 1944. The Soviet successes of 1943 continue into the new year. The siege of Leningrad is lifted by the end of January, almost 3 years after it started. Ukraine and Galicia are captured in March, and the Germans are forced to evacuate the Crimean Peninsula. Odessa and Sevastopol are liberated in April and May. On the 9th of June, Operation Bagration is launched to retake Belarus. 166 Soviet divisions with approximately 2,700 Soviet tanks advance on the 38 German divisions of Army Group Centre. Oh, sorry. That's British English. Army Group Center. Initially capturing Minsk in early July. July 1944. With a breakthrough expected further south in the Balkans and German forces hard pressed along the entire front, Hitler orders the deployment of the Toten Corps to stem the Soviet tide. Faced with impending destruction at the hands of the Soviets, the German army balks less at the use of the Toten Corps than before, focusing instead on the impact on their hated enemy. Almost immediately, the Soviet army halts, and in the window of opportunity it presents, the German army reorganize and solidify their defensive lines. August 1944. Early August sees the uprising of the Polish Home Army in Warsaw. Stalin chooses not to support the efforts of the Poles, and the Germans unleash the Toten Corps and Waffen-SS in a brutal suppression of the uprising. Despite brave resistance, the Polish Home Army under General Komorowski, I don't know how to read Polish, is effectively destroyed by mid-September. German reprisals are even harsher. Warsaw is leveled and many thousands of Poles are killed as the Germans form their defensive lines around the city. Flashback. The Siege of Stalingrad, 1942-43. The battle for the Eastern Front was shaped by the events that unfolded after the Siege of Stalingrad in 1943. The brutal close-quarter fighting that characterized the battle drew the attention of both Hitler and Stalin. Neither commander could afford to lose the battle, and in November 1942, the Soviet Operation Uranus was designed to trap the German Sixth Army in the ruins of the city. However, von Manstein's 11th Army was able to extract the 6th Army from the shattered city and deal the Soviets a propaganda blow in the process. Although Germany technically lost the battle, Stalin's fury that the Germans extracted themselves in good order was compounded by the skillful defensive actions carried out by the exhausted German forces on their way back to Axis lines. By February 1943, the German lines were stable, their forces re-equipped, and their morale restored. In comparison, the Soviet commanders were dismissed by Stalin, their forces in disarray, and their morale shaken. September 1944. When the Finns announce a ceasefire with the Soviet Union, the Germans respond with an evacuation of forces from Finland into Norway and Denmark. Initial cooperation between the Finns and Germans eventually gives way to sporadic and uncoordinated hostilities. October 1944. Soviet progress in the Baltic and Poland effectively grinds to a halt in the face of entrenched German resistance. The threat of the Toten Corps, the Polish Polish resistance activity in reprisal for the Soviet Union's inactivity during the Warsaw Uprising, allegedly backed by US and UK agents. The ruins of Warsaw become the focus of the northern front line. To the south, limited progress is made in liberating Yugoslavia and Romania, but Soviet confidence is lacking, and several opportunities to inflict decisive damage to the German and local defenders are missed. November to December 1944. The Eastern Front deteriorates into fractured conflicts. In the north, the Soviets maintain pressure on the Germans, with fighting heaviest around the embattled city of Warsaw. The intensity of the fighting effectively renders the city uninhabited, but its symbolism as Poland's capital means neither Hitler nor Stalin will let the other side seize it. In a smaller rerun of Stalingrad, the opposing armies settle into a brutal close-quarters battle. To the south, the battles for Hungary, Yugoslavia, and the Balkans degenerate into local power struggles between isolated German forces, their local allies, pro-communist resistance fighters, and anti-communist militias, backed covertly by the US. The front line becomes difficult to discern, and the resistance fighters battle each other as much as their enemies. The Germans consolidate their positions in northern Norway, having defeated Finnish efforts to prevent them escaping Finland. Soviet frustrations at the poor performance of the Finnish military threatened to destabilize the Soviet-Finnish ceasefire. January 1945. The Soviet High Command, under direct orders from Stalin, attempts to encircle Warsaw and cut off the German defenders. Conscious of their failure to do so at Stalingrad and the subsequent escape of the German Sixth Army, the Soviet commanders dither and their plans are captured by the Germans. Romania turns on its German allies in the face of overwhelming Soviet might, but realizes too late that the Soviets are likely to be no better friends. Nevertheless, Romanian forces capitulated to the Red Army and moved to the Hungarian border to assist the Soviet advance on Hungary. February through March 1945. The Soviet encirclement of Warsaw is launched and immediately falters in the face of prepared German defensive positions. Concentrated anti-tank weaponry decimates the leading Soviet tank regiments. At night, German super soldiers, the Schreckwolfen, wreak havoc amongst Soviet positions. In many places, Soviet infantry desert in massive numbers, with their officers either dead or unable to stop them. By the end of March, the Soviets have advanced around Warsaw but have failed to link up and isolate the city. With morale at worryingly low levels, the Soviet armies halt to consolidate, allowing the weary Germans time to bolster their defenses and prepare for the next assault. Part of this resupply includes heavy armored suits, designed and powered using new technology from the rifts. April through May 1945. With improving weather, the Soviets renew their offensive, but make little headway against German positions. In the south, US-backed anti-communist partisans cause chaos in Romania and Yugoslavia, attacking logistic routes and supply depots, and hampering Soviet operations against Hungary. Combined with Romanian forces' unwillingness to fight, the Soviet invasion of Hungary is delayed, giving Germany time to assist Hungary with its defenses. June through July 1945. German counterattacks incorporating the latest Rift-Tech weapons have some success in forcing the Soviet forces from the outskirts of Warsaw. Strange spherical turrets on German tanks unleash powerful bursts of energy that crush Soviet armor like paper. Fragile Soviet morale crumbles, once again forcing political officers to step in and crush any signs of weakness or dissent lest it spread. The Soviet lines hold, but the fighting spirit of the Soviet army hangs by a thread. August 1945. Massive efforts by the Soviet army force the Germans back from Warsaw. Soviet casualties are high, but some element of morale is restored as the Germans are found to be beatable once again. German forces hang on to the outskirts of Warsaw, but are cut off from their supply lines. Bitter fighting leaves both sides exhausted. The Soviet invasion of Hungary begins. 3 large Soviet armies advance into prepared and determined defenses and suffer extremely high casualties. German Rift-Tech weaponry again proves a match for the Soviet numbers, although Soviet imitations of German heavy infantry armor prove effective if somewhat crude. There's a helicopter passing over. September through October 1945. The German army finally manages to force its way through to its beleaguered troops in Warsaw, opening a corridor just wide enough to allow the survivors to escape and move west. The first massed deployment of German heavy infantry is a quantifiable success, punching through Soviet defenses and rescuing the encircled troops in Warsaw. Working with the heavy infantry is a variant of the Spinne Panzermech equipped with a flamethrower, purpose-built for the rubble-strewn chaos of Warsaw's streets. The arrival of Soviet heavy infantry is too late to stop the Germans from escaping. With the German army unable to pose a credible threat, Stalin turns his attention back to Finland. On the 12th of September 1945, the Soviets launch a concerted invasion of Finland, now practically unarmed as part of a ceasefire agreement made with Russia the year before. Unlike 1940, the Finns are in no position to resist experienced and battle-hardened Soviet formations, and the country sues for peace by the end of October. The Soviet operation is not without its difficulties, and numerous instances of bravery and military fortitude leads to the creation of an active Finnish underground, which the Soviets accuse of being equipped by the US and/or Germany. November 1945. The inexorable Soviet advance in Hungary sees the eastern part of the country fall to the Red Army, although they pay dearly for every mile they advance. With Budapest under threat, German High Command diverts resources from Italy to halt the Soviets in the south. The appearance of the fearsome Nachtjägers and new tanks armed with gravity pulse weapons slow the Soviet advance to a crawl. December 1945 through February 1946. By mid-December, with Finland and Romania under Soviet rule, the Soviet juggernaut prepares to advance westward. Suffering from partisan attacks across the territory it now controls, large numbers of troops are required to ensure logistics routes remain open. The drain on manpower and the constant and unexpected attacks ensure that Soviet morale barely rises above a low ebb. Germany sends most of its dreaded Nachtjägers east, and operating behind enemy lines, they sow yet more chaos. Soviet artillery begins bombarding the easternmost suburbs of Budapest, but German and Hungarian defenses hold. The arrival of a regiment of Thor heavy panzermechs has the dual effect of raising Axis morale and further demoralizing the Soviets. March 1946. In the north, Soviet armies advance as part of their Vistula offensive. Leading the advance are the new Cossack reconnaissance walkers and elite Siberian wolves, equipped and trained with the best the Soviet Union can provide. Utilizing a bridgehead at Sandomierz in the south of Warsaw, the First Belarusian Front pushes west, forcing the German line to buckle before multiple crossings of the Vistula River north of Warsaw push the Germans back toward their borders. The Soviets launch their attack on Budapest. Romanian troops make the first attacks and are repulsed with heavy casualties. The German Thor panzermechs take on a near mythical status. Poorly organized Romanian attacks are defeated again and again by their howitzers and thick armor, until the Romanians refuse to attack anywhere a Thor is believed to be present. Soviet operations are hardly more successful. Using their new Cossack light walkers, the Soviets make some headway on the outskirts of Budapest, but the walkers are no match for dug-in defenders, and only as the Soviet heavy infantry can push forward deeper in the city. Unsupported, they too are eventually forced to retreat. April through June 1946. German counterattacks in the north, often led by platoons of Zeus panzermechs and Tiger II tanks, first disrupt and then halt the Soviet advances. Combined with attacks by Schreckwolfen, Nachtjägers, and the Totenkorps, the Germans succeed in undoing the Soviet successes of the previous months. By the end of June, the Soviets are held along a front running from Danzig in the north, where German defenders hold the city and its immediate surroundings, to Budapest in the south. I'm trying to decide if... Also, I mispronounced it. Danzig. I'm trying to decide if it's a political statement that they're calling it Danzig, instead of Gdansk. The improved weather in the south gives rise to increased partisan activity. In Romania and Yugoslavia, a mix of communist, anti-communist, fascist, anti-fascist, and pro-democracy partisan groups, mostly supplied by Germany, Russia, or the USA. Pro-democracy I think we would just call Republican normally. Drag the region into chaos. In this environment, criminals and warlords further destabilize the countries. The rule of law becomes effective only where soldiers provide it, forcing yet more troops into garrisons in most towns and cities. July 1946. After the repeated failings of the First Belarusian Front to defeat the German forces, Stalin orders a purge of his failing officers. Despite warnings, he replaces experienced generals with a more youthful but less seasoned cadre of Stalinists. The Soviet war machine is forced into relative inactivity in the north. Morale is shattered, The chain of command is ripped apart, and the urgings of Stalin to crush the weary German forces fall upon an increasingly dispirited force. Better news for the Russians comes from the south. Budapest finally falls with the arrival of the Soviet answer to the Thor, the Mammoth. Equally armored and equipped with multiple turrets, the Mammoth evens the playing field in urban combat, allowing the Soviets massive numerical superiority to win the day. As Budapest falls, Hungary surrenders, although large elements of its military retreat in good order with their German allies. Unlike Romania, Hungary makes no effort to lend its military might to the Soviets, who are now left with the task of garrisoning yet another country and facing another force of anti-communist partisans. August through September 1946. Struggling to adjust to the impact of Stalin's purges, the First Belarusian Front is unable to continue their offensive in the face of increased German confidence. Resistance in Finland is a further drain on resources, and the summer becomes a series of meeting engagements between aggressive Russian raids on German positions. German counterattacks grow bolder as the Soviet army's fragile condition becomes apparent. Soviet desertions reach record numbers. October 1946. Building on the respite gained in the previous 2 months, the Germans launch a vicious counterattack, utilizing the latest in their Rift Tech arsenal. Operation Valhalla utilizes the latest in Rift Tech, the new Falcon or Falke armor, which enables Fallschirmjäger regiments to conduct a number of commando raids on Soviet headquarters well behind the front lines. Rumors of Colonel Skorzeni's involvement further adds to his increasing legend both at home and abroad. As the German heavy tanks and panzermechs hit Russian positions north of Warsaw on 17th of October, the commandos neutralize the Soviets' ability to respond coherently. Over 10 days, the German advance, crossing the Vistula and sending the Russians steaming east. By the 27th of October, German artillery shells Warsaw and the port of Königsberg, falls into German hands. Russian forces in Danzig are surrounded and cut off, but refuse to surrender. Without the resources to forcibly eject them, Germany surrounds the city and prepares to starve the defenders out. With the support of the Red Army, the Czechoslovakian Communist Resistance launches a series of attacks against German and pro-German Czech forces. German reprisals are swift and brutal, but most of the guerrilla forces are able to escape capture. With the weather deteriorating rapidly and increased German security operations, the partisan movement is forced to suspend its operations. November 1946 through February 1947. The most savage winter in memory proves too much for even the most resilient Soviets. Military activity slows to a crawl. Offensive operations struggle to achieve any meaningful result, and, as in the West, the Germans take advantage of the weather to consolidate their positions. In the Balkans, the various guerrilla and partisan bands are forced into inactivity, as many perish in their countryside hideouts. German and Soviet special forces ensure that war is not forgotten, but the tempo falls to its lowest ebb. All sides use the respite to develop increasingly sophisticated weaponry and restore the fighting strength of their forces. March 1947. This is now.